Hello again. Sorry, no snazzy jazzy introduction this time. Just me. So, I want to pick up where we left off, which was basically talking about some of the consequences that follow from Spinoza's idea that there is only one substance, and that substance is to be identified with God. So, one of those consequences that we talked about last time is his causal or his logical determinism, right? And that tells us something about what we are. We know that what we are effects of God. But there's more to be said here. And the more to be said here with regard to the relation between the mind and the body and the human mind, and what the human mind can know, are the topics of part 2 of the ethics, of the nature and the origin of the mind. It's important to note that part 2 of the ethics, like part 1 of the ethics, starts with a set of definitions and axioms. Unfortunately, they're not quite as unarguable, I think, as the ones in part 1. They are much more tendentious. And yet, here too, the conceit is that all of the propositions of part 2 follow from the definitions and the axioms at the beginning of part 2. So we can then go on. So here's another way of casting Spinoza's argument, what he's argued so far. So we know that there are modes of extension, but since modes are ontologically and logically dependent upon things, upon substances, right? If there are modes of extension, then we know that there is an extended thing. Similarly, if there are modes of thought, we know that there is at least a thinking thing, right? Proposition 5 has said that there can be at most one extended thing, and at most one thinking thing. So we know that as well. Now further, in Proposition 14, and some of the propositions leading up to it, Spinoza has argued that there can be only one thing. So it follows that the thinking thing and the extended thing must be one and the same thing. But this is, as some of you have pointed out in your worksheets, this is basically to deny that there is a real distinction between the mind and the body. They are not substances that can exist separately, the one from the other. There is only a conceptual distinction, a distinction that we can draw only in our minds, but not only in our heads, but doesn't point to any real distinction in reality. So since we can think about one without the other, but that means that they must represent nothing more than two perspectives on, or two ways of describing one and the same thing. So it follows from this, Proposition 7 of Part 2, that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. Here's what he says in the scholium to that proposition. He says, thinking substance and extended substance are one and the same substance, comprehended now under this attribute, now under that. So too, a mode of extension and the idea of that mode are one and the same thing, expressed in two ways. For example, a circle existing in nature and the idea of the existing circle, which is also in God, are one and the same thing, explicated through two different attributes. And so, whether we conceive nature under the attribute of extension, or under the attribute of thought, or under any other attribute, we find one and the same order, or one and the same connection of causes, that is, the same things following one another. There's some visuals here. So we presented Descartes as an interactionist, right? Holding that mind and body are two separate substances, two separate attributes, right? But that interact and interact causally. So physical states give rise to mental states, and mental states give rise to physical states. So, for example, if I drop a brick on my foot, the physical thing, the brick, falls onto the physical thing, my foot, and that causes the sensation of pain. That sensation of pain, in turn, a mental state, in turn causes me to pull back my foot sharply, So that mental state causes a corresponding physical state. So we have physical to mental causation and mental to physical causation. Obviously, we also have physical to physical causation and mental to mental causation, right? Mental states give rise to mental states, and physical states give rise to other physical states. But Spinoza is traditionally presented as a parallelist, right? He has argued that there is no causal interaction between mind and body, just a mirroring of the physical and the mental. I'll come back to this double aspect theory in a minute, because it's another way of possibly interpreting Spinoza. So there's a cute website which has many philosophy action figures on it. So here's Spinoza. I couldn't resist. So for Spinoza, thought and extension are two different ways of conceptualizing or describing nature, describing God. We could then, in theory, more on that in the next lecture, we could, in theory, provide a complete and total account of the universe as the logical causal progression of ideas, or as the logical causal progression of extended things, since the progression of ideas mirrors the progression of extended things. So they'd be the same story, told from two different points of view, or comprehended in two different ways. Another visual, as in my example, right? Brick on foot gives rise to pain states. Pain states give rise to the withdrawal of the foot. That's Cartesianism. Spinoza. Physical events only give rise to physical events. They never give rise to mental events. Mental events only give rise to mental events. Right? But for every physical event, there is a corresponding mental event. That is parallelism. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. So this means, of course, that what we dubbed the interaction problem, the problem of how material stuff, bodies, can act upon immaterial stuff, minds, and vice versa, which is seemingly a difficulty for Descartes, just doesn't arise for Spinoza. For Spinoza, there is no causal interaction at all. So what does this entail about our minds? Well, Proposition 11 says, that which constitutes the actual being of the human mind is basically nothing else but the idea of an individual actually existing thing. So whatever it is that constitutes the mind, whatever it is that makes up the mind, is the idea of some existing thing. What existing thing? We'll figure that out in Proposition 13, which you can anticipate here. Proposition 12. Whatever happens in the object of the idea constituting the human mind, that is, in that actually existing thing the mind is the idea of, is bound to be perceived by the human mind. That is, he says, the idea of that thing will necessarily be in the human mind. That is to say, for example, if the object of the idea constituting the human mind is a body, nothing can happen in that body without its being perceived by the mind. So if the object of the idea constituting the human mind, if what the human mind is the idea of is the body, then nothing can happen in that body without its being perceived by the mind. And then Proposition 13 gives us this conditional. The object of the idea constituting the human mind is the body. That is a definite mode of extension, actually existing, and nothing else. So the mind is the idea of the body. And what that means is that for every event, for every affection, for every property, for every quality of the body, there is a corresponding idea in the mind, albeit, as you might anticipate, often very obscurely perceived. But wait a minute. If the mind is the idea of the body, does that entail that the body is ontologically more basic than the mind? That is, if there can't be a mind unless there is a body of which it is the idea, then doesn't that mean that bodies are ontologically more fundamental than our minds? Minds depend upon the existence of body. And if so, does that mean that Spinoza is really a kind of materialist? He'd be a non-reductive materialist, what that earlier slide described as a double aspect theorist. So he'd be a non-reductive materialist for sure. That is, he would not believe that I could reduce or fully explain or account for mental states in terms of physical states. But non-reductive materialists are materialists nonetheless. So the traditional reading of Spinoza is that he is a dualist and a parallelist. But is that reading a misreading? And if we're inclined to think so, then maybe this is more fodder for the hideous atheist reading. So that's where we end for today, a relatively brief lecture. We're going to move on next time to the next lecture, which will talk a little bit about Spinoza's notion of human knowledge, what we can know and how we can know it, and his rationalism associated with that, which should be fairly apparent in everything that has led up to this so far. And we will also, either in the next lecture or the lecture after, finally get to what is the central topic of Spinoza's ethics, but pretty clearly easily lost along this long and winding path, and that is his ethics. Remember that this work is entitled The Ethics. That's it for today, and that's it for this lecture. Take good care. We'll talk to you soon.